The words came out of her husband's mouth in flawless French, and Natalie felt the champagne flute grow cold between her fingers. They were standing in the private reception lounge at the Fairmont Le Chateau Frontenac in Quebec City. One of those rooms that smelled like old money and fresh flowers, where the chandeliers cast everyone in the same flattering amber glow. Outside the tall windows, the St. Lawrence glittered under the October sky. It was the kind of evening that was supposed to be beautiful. And it had been, right up until the moment Natalie heard her name spoken in a language her husband believed she didn't understand. Natalie est gentille, mais honnêtement. Julien paused to accept a canapé from a passing server, unhurried, entirely unbothered. Elle n'a jamais vraiment compris ce monde-là. Elle sourit bien. C'est suffisant pour les événements. She is sweet, but honestly, she has never really understood this world. She smiles nicely. That's enough for events. He was speaking to Sébastien Archambault, senior partner at Archambault & Morel, the firm Julien had been courting for a merger for the better part of a year. Sébastien was the kind of man who wore cufflinks that cost more than most people's rent. Silver, monogrammed, catching the light every time he raised his glass. He had a reputation for being difficult to impress and impossible to fool. Julien had told Natalie this at least a dozen times in the weeks leading up to tonight. She had smiled and nodded and helped him choose his tie. Natalie kept her eyes on the window. She took a slow sip of champagne. She did not let her face move. What Julien did not know, what he had never thought to ask, in 4 years of marriage, was that Natalie had grown up in Montreal. Her mother was Quebecoise. French had been the language of Sunday dinners and arguments and lullabies and grocery lists. She had attended French immersion through high school, studied 2 semesters at Université de Montréal, before transferring to finish her business degree in Toronto, where she had met Julien at a conference, and he had decided, within the first hour, that he already knew everything about her worth knowing. He had never asked where she grew up. She had told him, once, early on. He had nodded and moved on to talking about his own childhood in West Vancouver. Et la femme? Sébastien asked, glancing briefly in her direction. And the wife? Julien smiled, the same smile he used in boardrooms. Elle est décorative, he said. Et discrète. Deux qualités très pratiques. She is decorative. And discreet. 2 very practical qualities. Sébastien made a sound that might have been polite agreement, or might have been discomfort. He glanced at Natalie again, something unreadable crossing his face, and then looked away. Natalie set her champagne glass down on a passing tray. Very gently, not a sound. She thought about the drive up from Toronto 2 days ago, Julien behind the wheel, narrating his strategy for the Archambault merger the entire way. She had listened, asked useful questions, made notes in the small leather notebook she always carried. He had appreciated that. In the abstract way he appreciated furniture that was well placed or coffee that appeared before he asked for it. She thought about the 4 years of dinners she had organized, the client events she had managed, the quiet way she had made herself indispensable to Julien's professional life, while he told everyone she was just his wife. She thought about the business she had been quietly running for 2 years. A boutique financial consulting practice she had built with her own saving and her own contacts and her own years of experience, operating under her maiden name, Nathalie Cotte, not Natalie Hartwell, because Julien had once said, half-joking, that it might be awkward for her to trade on his connections. She had taken that as a reason to build connections of her own. She thought about the conversation she'd had with her lawyer 3 weeks ago, when she'd finally made an appointment she had been postponing for 8 months. The reception continued. Julien circulated. Natalie circulated. She accepted compliments on her dress, made small talk with 2 other spouses who had clearly been parked in the same corner with the same vague smiles, and kept Julien in her peripheral vision the entire time. Just before dinner was called, Sébastien Archambault found her standing near the fireplace. Madame Hartwell, he said, in French with a slight formality, you must be very patient to accompany your husband to so many of these evenings. He did not know she would understand him. She could see that in his face. He was making conversation, not expecting much back. Oh, I manage, she said in French, matching his register precisely. Though I confess I find the business side more interesting than most people expect. Sébastien's expression shifted, not dramatically, but visibly. A recalibration. You speak French, he said. I grew up in Montreal, she said simply. A pause. He looked at her differently then. Not in the way men sometimes looked at women when they were surprised, with condescension tucked inside the compliment. More like someone who had just realized they had been reading a map upside down. Your husband didn't mention that. No, Natalie said pleasantly, he didn't. She excused herself to go into dinner. She sat across from Julien at the long table and watched him tell the same 3 stories he always told at these events. And she ate her meal and answered questions when she was asked and said almost nothing unprompted. Which was what she always did, which was why no one had ever thought to wonder what was happening behind her eyes. That night, in their hotel room, Julian was pleased. The evening had gone well, he felt. Sebastian seemed warmer than expected. He thought the merger was moving forward. "You were wonderful tonight," he said, already looking at his phone. "Perfect. Thank you," Natalie said. She waited until he was asleep before she went to sit in the chair by the window, looking out at the river. She had been waiting 8 months. She thought she could wait a little longer. She had started the process quietly, the way she did most things. Her lawyer's name was Paulette Girard, and she operated out of a small, precise office in the annex in Toronto. And she had the kind of stillness that made you feel like everything was under control. They had met twice before Natalie had shared the whole picture. By the third meeting, Paulette had pulled out a notepad and said, in her measured way, "All right. Let's talk about what you actually have." What Natalie had was considerable. She had a copy of their marriage contract, including the infidelity clause her own father had insisted on before the wedding. Her father, now retired, had spent 30 years as a family lawyer in Montreal, and he had read every line of that document before he allowed her to sign it. Julian had agreed to the clause without much discussion. He had been confident, in that early period, in a way that seemed to come from never having been seriously tested. The clause was simple. Evidence of an extramarital relationship rendered the entire agreement void. Without the agreement, Natalie was entitled to her full share of the marital assets under Ontario family law. She also had photographs, dates, a series of hotel receipts she had come across by accident 14 months ago and then, very deliberately, stopped coming across by accident. She had forwarded everything to a secure folder. She had been methodical about it, the same way she was methodical about everything. Julian had been seeing someone for at least 18 months. Her name was Courtney, and she worked in business development at a firm that did consulting for Julian's company. And she had called the house once, 8 months ago, with some urgent question about a contract clause, and Natalie had answered and been perfectly polite, and then sat very still at the kitchen counter for almost an hour before she made an appointment with Paulette. "You have enough," Paulette told her at their 4th meeting. "You've had enough for a while, actually. What are you waiting for?" Natalie had looked at the window. "The right moment," she said. There was one other thing. 6 months ago, her company, Côté Consulting, had been approached about a project, a significant one, a long-term contract with a national financial institution, the kind that would require her to scale up, hire staff, establish the firm as something more than a boutique operation. She had been working toward it quietly, the same way she worked toward everything. If it came through in the next few weeks, as Paulette's projections suggested it would, she would have the foundation she needed. She didn't want to leave Julian's world and simply survive. She wanted to leave it and not need it at all. The Quebec City trip was in October. By November the contract had come through. Natalie signed the papers in Paulette's office on a Tuesday afternoon, her hands steady. And then she drove home through the early dark, and made dinner, and waited. The moment came on a Wednesday at an industry gala in downtown Toronto, the kind of event Julian attended 3 or 4 times a year and always brought her to, because as she now knew, she smiles nicely and that's enough for events. This particular gala was at the Bram and Bluma Appel Salon at the Toronto Reference Library. Not the usual venue, which Natalie had always liked about it. Exposed brick, warm lighting, the sense of books stacked somewhere just beyond reach. She wore a dark green dress she had bought specifically for this evening. She had not told Julian that. Julian's colleagues were there. Sébastien Archambault was there, having made the trip from Quebec City, which surprised her. And Courtney was there, in her official capacity, as a representative of her firm, wearing a cream blazer and standing slightly too close to Julian during cocktail hour in a way that other people probably didn't notice. Natalie noticed. She spent the cocktail hour in conversation with 3 other women she had met at various events over the years. One of whom turned out to run a marketing firm with offices in Calgary and Vancouver. One of whom was a recently retired civil servant who now sat on several boards. And one of whom was Sébastien Archambault's wife, a small, sharp-eyed woman named Hélène, who turned out to have grown up 3 neighborhoods away from Natalie's mother in Montreal. They spoke French together for 10 minutes. Natalie felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized had been tight. When they moved into dinner, she was seated across from Julian and 2 seats down from Sébastien. Courtney was at a different table. Julian was performing his boardroom self with complete fluency, and Natalie watched him for a moment before she turned to the man seated to her left. a technology executive named Werner who had recently moved from Hamburg and was still finding his footing in Toronto, and she asked him, in German, if he had managed to try anything good in the city yet. She had taken 2 years of German in university. She was not fluent, but she was good enough. Werner's face did something wonderful. He answered in German, slower than he might naturally speak, and she followed, and they had a small, genuine conversation about a ramen place in Kensington Market that Werner had discovered with some surprise. Julian, 2 seats away, glanced over once and then back at his own conversation. He hadn't registered what language she was speaking. He never thought to register things like that. Over dessert, Sebastian leaned slightly toward her. Madame Hartwell, he said in French, quiet enough that it was just between them. I wanted to tell you. I thought about our conversation in Quebec City. About you finding the business side more interesting than people expect. I remember, she said. I mentioned it to a colleague of mine. She runs a financial advisory group. She was looking for someone with exactly that kind of, he paused, range. I gave her your name. I hope that was all right. Natalie looked at him. You gave her Natalie Hartwell? No, he said, something careful in his voice. I gave her Natalie Cate. I looked up your firm after Quebec City. She held his gaze for a moment. Thank you, Sebastian. He nodded very slightly and turned back to his meal. After dinner, Julian found her near the coat check. He was in a good mood, the slightly flushed warmth of a successful evening settling over him. Ready? He said, which was how he always signaled that it was time to leave. In a minute, she said. She walked back toward the main room, where the gala was winding down, clusters of people finding their coats and saying their goodbyes. She stopped near the windows that looked out over Asquith Avenue and took one long breath. Then she turned around and walked to where Julian was waiting. I need to talk to you, she said. He looked at her, half distracted. Now tonight, when we get home. Something in her voice must have caught him. He focused the way he rarely focused on her. Is everything all right? No, she said, but it will be. They drove home mostly in silence. Julian tried once, gently, to ask what was going on. She told him they would talk at home. He tried to read her face and couldn't, which unsettled him in a way she could see. At the house, she set her bag on the counter and took off her earrings and put them down carefully, and then she turned around. I want a divorce, she said. The silence was very complete. Natalie, I know about Courtney, she said. I've known for a long time. I have documentation. 14 months of it. Julian's face went through several things in quick succession. Denial gathered itself and then collapsed before he even opened his mouth, because she had said 14 months with a steadiness that made arguments seem beside the point. The marriage contract has an infidelity clause, she continued. My father put it there. You agreed to it. With the clause triggered, the contract is void, and under Ontario family law, I'm entitled to equitable distribution. Paulette Girard has the documentation. Everything goes through her from now on. Who is Paulette? My lawyer. He sat down on the arm of the sofa, which was something she had never seen him do before. He always sat properly, or stood. The sitting on the arm looked like something going out of him. Natalie, he said, and his voice had changed. Quieter. We can fix this. We can work through it. I'll end things with Courtney. We can go to someone. We can know, she said. Think about what you're walking away from. The house? I'm not walking away from anything, she said. I'm taking what's mine, including the 11 years I spent building a career I put on hold because you said it might be awkward for me to trade on your connections. She paused. I built different connections. Something moved through his face then. Not shame, exactly. More like the first moment of understanding how thoroughly he had misread a situation he thought he had completely under control. I didn't know you were. He stopped. Started again. The consulting firm has had a contract with Northgate Financial since November, she said. We're scaling up in the new year. He stared at her. I also speak French, she said. Fluently, since childhood. In case that's relevant to anything you may have said in Quebec City. The color left his face in a way that was almost clinical to watch. She had expected to feel something large in this moment, rage or grief or the hot satisfaction of having waited and finally speaking. Instead she felt clear. A particular kind of quiet that she had not felt in years. I'm staying with my sister tonight, she said. Paulette will be in touch with your lawyer's office by Monday. She picked up her bag. She had packed it that afternoon, while Julian was at the office, and left it in her car. She did not look back as she walked out. Her sister Margot lived in a semi-detached on Hibbern Road in the Annex, 12 minutes away. Margot opened the door before Natalie even knocked, which meant she had been watching from the window, which was so entirely like her, that Natalie laughed for the first time in what felt like a very long time. Come in, Margot said. I made tea and I bought those cookies you like from the Portuguese place on Harvard. Natalie sat at Margot's kitchen table, with her hands wrapped around a mug, and told her everything. Not the legal parts, Margot knew those. The other parts. The champagne flute in Quebec City. The French she had not spoken out loud in that house in 4 years. Werner from Hamburg and his ramen discovery. Sébastien Archambault looking up her firm. Margot listened with the specific focused attention she had always given to things that mattered, leaning on the table with her chin in her hand, and when Natalie was done she said, "He said you were decorative and discreet. 2 practical qualities. Right?" Margot picked up a cookie. "Well, let's see how practical he finds the next 6 months." Julian's lawyers were, as expected, aggressive. They contested the documentation, questioned the timeline, tried to argue that the infidelity clause was unenforceable on a technicality so thin it was almost embarrassing. Paulette handled it with the same stillness she brought to everything. And when Julian's side pushed back hard on the asset valuation, she produced a financial timeline that accounted for every year of Natalie's contributions to the household, the networking, the event management, the organizational infrastructure that had allowed Julian to do his job as thoroughly as he did. Julian tried to reach her once, directly, a voicemail she listened to once and then did not return. He said he had made a terrible mistake. He said he didn't realize. He said she had never told him how she felt. She had told him. In the early years she had told him many times, in many registers, direct, gentle, joking, serious. He had listened the way people listen when they're not really listening, and then he had moved on to whatever was next. At some point she had stopped telling him. She hadn't even noticed the exact moment it happened. She did not call back. All communication went through Paulette. The divorce was finalized in the spring. The settlement was equitable in the precise sense of the word. The house was sold, the assets divided. Her contribution to the marriage acknowledged in legal language that Julian's lawyers had fought and failed to minimize. She did not take what wasn't hers. She took what was. The last time she saw Julian was across a conference table in Paulette's boardroom, both of them flanked by lawyers, signing things. He looked tired in a way she recognized as real, not performed. She felt something that might have been pity, briefly, and then it passed. Outside on the street afterward, Paulette said, "How do you feel?" "Like myself," Natalie said. For the first time in a while. She moved into a condo on the east side of the city, near the water, with high ceilings and west-facing windows that caught the late afternoon light in a way that made the whole place glow. She bought plants. She painted one wall a deep, particular blue that Julian would have said was too much. She hired 2 people at Cote Consulting in January and 2 more in March. The referral from Sébastien's colleague had come through in December. A contract for cross-cultural financial strategy with a francophone firm, expanding into English-speaking markets. Natalie's particular combination of French fluency, business background, and cross-regional experience turned out to be exactly what they needed, and she had not had to explain herself once. She started speaking French again, deliberately, at the market on the weekends when she overheard someone struggling to make themselves understood. On calls with clients from Quebec. With her mother, who had always said she was sorry the language had been so dormant during Natalie's marriage, and Natalie had always said, "It's fine," and now said, "I know." Instead, she joined a board. Not a prominent one, not right away. A small nonprofit that supported financial literacy programs in newcomer communities, the kind of work she had wanted to do years ago and deferred. The meetings were on Tuesday evenings and she never missed one. Werner from Hamburg emailed in February. He had been connected to her firm through a mutual contact and had only realized partway through the initial call that she was the same woman from the gala. He found this charming. His company ended up becoming a client by April, and at the signing lunch he brought up Kensington Market and asked if she had been to the ramen place herself. She had actually, 3 times. The following October, exactly 1 year after Quebec City, Natalie was at a small industry dinner in the private room of a restaurant on King Street West. She had been invited to speak on a panel about cross-border consulting and the specific challenges of working across language divides in Canadian markets, which remained something most people in the room had not thought carefully enough about. She was reviewing her notes in the anteroom when she heard, through the half-open door, someone from the organizing committee mention Julian's name. Not unkindly, but with a certain weight. Something about the merger with Archambault not going forward after all. Something about the due diligence process having raised concerns that hadn't been there at the beginning. She folded her notes. She had not followed Julian's career. She found, in that moment, that she did not especially want to now. She picked up her water glass and waited until the panel was called. When it was her turn to speak, she talked for 12 minutes about the particular cost of assuming you understand a room when you haven't bothered to learn its language. She meant it professionally. She meant it in other ways too. The audience was attentive, and when she finished there was the kind of silence that precedes applause rather than follows confusion. And then the room filled up with both. Afterward, Hélène Archambault appeared at her elbow. She had not known Hélène would be here. Hélène handed her a glass of wine and said, in French, "My husband told me about Quebec City. He felt terrible." "He shouldn't have," Natalie said. "He did me a favor." Hélène studied her. "You seem well." "I am," Natalie said. And then, because it was true and because Hélène had offered her own kind of quiet solidarity, "Better than I've been in years." They stood together looking out the restaurant window at King Street, the evening traffic, the particular amber of a Toronto autumn evening. Natalie thought about the woman who had stood at a window in Quebec City a year ago, holding a champagne flute she hadn't let tremble, listening to her husband describe her as decorative, in a language he believed she didn't speak. She thought about the months of patience, the lawyer appointments, the silent accumulation of what she needed to walk away cleanly and completely. She thought about what she had built in the years since, the clients, the contracts, the Tuesday evenings, the blue wall, the 3 times at the ramen place, and the growing list of things she did now because she wanted to, not because they suited someone else's picture of who she was. Julian had thought he knew her. He had decided he knew her within the first hour they'd ever spoken, and had not substantially revised that judgment in 4 years of marriage. He had made her small in his mind because it was convenient, and she had let it happen because she had been young and trusting and had believed, for longer than she should have, that being loved meant being seen. She knew better now. Her phone buzzed, a message from Margot. "How did the panel go?" She typed back, "Really well." 3 dots appeared. Then, obviously, "I'll get the good ones." Natalie put her phone away and turned back to the room, which was full of people who wanted to keep talking, and she went to meet them.